Hello and welcome to Epochs number 80, hosted by me, Bodade. This week, unfortunately, due to scheduling issues and illnesses and various other things, it's just going to be a solo effort by me. So you'll have to put up with an old school history bro solo style one. It's the first time we've done it in nearly 2 years, so I hope you forgive us. All right, so let's start. I'm going to continue the series we're doing on the monarchy. And so last time we finished up with the death of William the Conqueror. We had that one on the Doomsday Book, didn't we? But to carry on the story, the narrative, we'll have to go on to the monarch directly after William the Conqueror, which was his second son, who was also called William. So William II, often known as William Rufus. Which comes from the word red. He apparently had red hair. Sometimes even is called William the Red. So I've got lots of quotes here. This might be a fairly quote-heavy one this time. What I wanted to do is, I did it on my own channel actually once on this very topic, is to quote the same bits of history from different historians to see, so we can maybe see how different historians deal with the same material. And because William Rufus's reign, although it was 13 years long, there's actually not a fantastic amount of detail. We are still in the Dark Ages, late Dark Ages. Some historians like to say that the Middle Ages start with William the Conqueror, but I think that's a bit much. I think we're still really in the Dark Ages. I mean, we are in the Dark Ages in the sense that there isn't a fantastic amount of material. There is obviously the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and a few chroniclers and things, but looking at it in the vast sweep of the full sweep of history, there's actually even less information about Rufus than about William the Conqueror himself. So even, as I say, even though it's 13 years, there isn't just a huge amount, and there's sort of a few highlights for Rufus, 3 or 4 or 5 sort of big topics or themes, which all histories about him will deal with. So I thought I'd go through that and with different historians, see what they say about things. I've got Nicholas Vincent, Mark Morris, Sir Winston Churchill, of course, and Sir Charles Oman, the original, the OG. So let me just start by just reading a fairly short paragraph just from Oman on William Rufus. And the first thing to mention, I suppose, would be, kind of obviously when you think about it, that the most important thing in his reign was how to deal with the fallout of everything the Conqueror had done, the Norman conquest. Because, of course, we all know, especially if you've watched the last few epochs, that William the Conqueror himself was able to hold everything together through a force of will, a force of personality. And that's what absolute monarchies are all about, really. If you've got a very, very strong character, very, very strong personality, and you're able to do it, then it's okay, right? But if you're weak or you're just not capable enough in that seat, then it's going to be a problem. However, the Conqueror's sons, with one exception, were exactly that. They were capable, and we'll talk about it, because William Rufus's story is very, very much bound up with his older brother, Robert Curthose. Yeah, he had an older brother. So that's sort of one of the main things you have to keep in mind, is that the succession, the crown of England, and the ducal coronet of Normandy as well, it didn't all pass to just the eldest son, which you would sort of expect in later centuries. That is how it would always go, as a matter of law. But back in the late 11th century, that wasn't necessarily the case. And the oldest surviving boy, was Robert Curthose, and William the Conqueror decided not to give him the crown of England anyway. But here's an overview type paragraph from Sir Charles Oman. He said, quote, "The 80 years which followed the death of William the Conqueror were spent in the solution of the problem which he had left behind him. William had brought over to England two principles of conflicting tendency, the one that of strong monarchical government, where everything depended on the king, the other that of feudal anarchy. He himself had been able to control the turbulent horde of military adventurers among whom he had distributed the lands of England, But would his sons be equally successful? Butchered that last little bit, didn't I? Would his sons be equally successful? Question mark. This is a big question. William the Conqueror's obviously not a unique type person, but nearly. There aren't that many men in history that are as bold, brash, confident. There's lots of words you could use to describe him, but the bottom line was that he was good at his job of conquering things and holding on to it. So anyone that knows a bit of history knows that it's one thing to conquer a land, it's another to hold it for 20 years or more. It's yet another thing to pass it on to your progeny that are capable of holding it themselves. So it was a real question. Would his sons be able to keep on to this? Because I say it's only been 20 years, so it's still within living memory. People didn't live as long back then, but still, there'd be lots and lots of people alive who remembered England before the Norman conquest. And so it is surprising, we all know, don't we, if you've seen king lists and things, that the Normans did hold on to it. I hope that's not a spoiler to tell you that. But let me read a slightly longer paragraph here from Nicholas Vincent, Modern Historians. Goes a bit more further into the detail of the events that happened. Okay, well, Nicholas Vincent said this, quote, on his deathbed, William the Conqueror's deathbed, on his deathbed, although showing traditional pious regard for the redemption of his soul, he failed to make any definite provision for the succession. As a result, there was yet another succession crisis, the first of many still to come. Between 1066 and 1216, a period of 150 years, no king of England came to the throne as the firstborn son of his predecessor, and not until 1272 did the succession of such a firstborn son occur in peacetime and apparently without dispute. From the events of 1087, which is the death of William the Conqueror, the Conqueror's son, William, known as Rufus the Red, emerged with the greater share of the spoils. Crossing immediately to England, and with the assistance of Archbishop Lanfranc, Rufus seized the treasury at Winchester and had himself crowned king in Westminster Abbey. Robert Curthose, that is the oldest brother, Robert Curthose, short legs, or short stockings. Robert Curthose, still in disgrace because he had rebelled from his father a couple of times. At the point of his death was in the middle of a revolt. Still in disgrace and therefore absent from his father's deathbed, found himself deprived of the larger part of his potential inheritance. The outcome was warfare between Robert as Duke of Normandy and Rufus as King of England. The vastly superior financial resources of England enabled Rufus to root Robert out of Normandy, at first under threat of military conquest, thereafter by the liberal disbursement of cash. After 1096, and in return for a massive payment of 10,000 marks, Rufus bought out Robert's claim to Normandy. Robert himself used the money, itself an indication of the vast superiority of English over Norman wealth, to raise an army for the First Crusade. In theory, his arrangement with Rufus was set to last for 3 years. In practice, it was not expected that Robert would return from the east. As both parties were aware, Robert's grandfather, the father of William the Conqueror, had embarked for Jerusalem in the 1030s and had never come back. In Robert's case, however, not only did the First Crusade lend him enormous prestige, but returning via the Norman colony in southern Italy, it brought him a wife. The wife in turn brought him a son and heir, and a very considerable dowry, with which, once again, to finance war against his brothers. So you go, there's a bit there, I've jumped ahead a few years, but that is sort of one of the first main talking points of William Rufus's life, is that he sort of seized the crown and, as I say at the beginning, his life and reign is completely bound up, entwined with his elder brother, because they never stop fighting each other one way or another. In fact, Curthose, just to cut ahead on this, and even some information about what I'll be talking about in the next epochs, Curthose lives for ages and ages. He lives to be in his 80s, I think late 80s. He outsurvives everyone in the family, even his own son, and spends a lot of that time. Well, actually, I won't do too many spoilers for the next one. But the fact is, he lives a long, long time. He outlives Rufus by decades and decades and decades. They've got a much younger brother, the youngest son, Henry, who himself becomes king later. That will be the next Epochs. And he's like a much younger brother. He's like 20 odd years younger than Curthose. And they end up dying within a couple of months of each other in the end. Henry does outlive Curthose. He's the only one that outlives him, but by a couple of months. So Curthose, you can bear in mind, survives everything. As I mentioned there, he goes on crusade. I'll talk a bit more about that in detail in a minute. But yeah, he survives, so that's something to bear in mind, because he's just perennially there. He's sort of on and off. He's sort of always there in the background, or quite often not in the background at all, in the forefront. If I can read another paragraph about the same thing, really, but from Mark Morris, just so we can see how different historians deal with the same thing. I think that's interesting. I like to read the same bit of history from a different historian, just to see if they've got anything different to say or their take on it. Because without getting too deep into this, all history is a type of narrative. It's a story. None of us were there. So it's inevitably going to be a story. You can never reconstruct the past exactly perfectly. Historian will always, there's no way to avoid it, but they will always be imprinting their view, their vision on things. And so to avoid, having blinkers or just taking for granted whatever one historian said, it's good to read more than one source, I think. Anyway, historian Mark Morris wrote this. The Conqueror, in the end, felt compelled to recognise his eldest son as his heir of Normandy. Pardon me. As the king allegedly explained to those present at his deathbed, Robert had been invested with Normandy in 1066. That's true, because in 1066, just before he bounced over to England for the conquest, he left his eldest son, who at the time was quite young, I think only 14, 15 or 16 years old, sort of that ballpark. He sort of formally, legally made him his heir of Normandy, should he die. It wasn't a crazy thought that William the Conqueror might die in 1066. Hardrada had died, hadn't he? Harold Godwinson had beaten and killed Hardrada. But of course, we all know that it went the Normans' way in 1066. So Robert had been invested with Normandy in 1066 and had received the homage of its barons. Such bonds could not be undone. But this was only true of Normandy. England was not part of the inheritance, but an acquisition obtained by conquest. And because it had been won with so much blood, William declared that he dared not transmit it to anyone. I name no man as my heir to the kingdom of England, he concluded, but entrust it to God alone. Again, these are Aldrich's words. That's Aldrich Vitalis, a chronicler at the time, or a bit after actually, but someone in the 11th, 12th century. They're his words, really. William the Conqueror saying that, I entrust it to nobody. They're really more Aldrich's words than William the Conqueror's words, but nonetheless, it's still valuable and maybe not a verbatim quote of William the Conqueror, but still accurate. It's accurate. He could well have said that sort of thing, and even if he didn't, it still just rings true. So Mark Morris says, again, these are Aldrich's words, but their content draws strong support from the fact that the king was known to have bequeathed the royal regalia he used in Normandy, his crown, robe, sceptre, chalice, and candlesticks, not to any of his sons, but to his abbey of St. Stephen's in Caen. He did, however, express a personal hope that William Rufus would succeed him as King of England, if that turned out to be God's will. So there you go. When you don't leave a clear succession, that's a real problem in most centuries. And in the 11th century, of course, that's going to cause an issue. Because, Robert Curthose kind of rightly thought, that's not fair. Why can't I inherit it all? Well, one of the things is that he had rebelled against his father a few times. And so wasn't in his good books, to say the very least. I imagine that William the Conqueror he must have been, right, utterly exasperated with Curthose. Maybe Curthose was a little bit hard done by William, but you've got to wait your turn. That's how it works with hereditary rule. But Curthose wasn't prepared to wait. All right, one last one then from Winston Churchill on the first little bit and the death of the Conqueror and the immediate aftermath of that. Churchill wrote, quote, "In the first generation after the Norman conquest," quote, "the first generation after the Norman conquest formed a period where the victorious army and caste, who were settling themselves upon the lands that they had gained, and forced Saxon England, where the tie between a man and his lord was mainly personal, into the feudal pattern, where it primarily rested on landholding. Under William the Conqueror, this process had been harsh and thorough. Under his son William, dubbed Rufus the Red, it was not less harsh, but also capricious. Moreover, the ascension of the Conqueror's second surviving son to the throne of England did not pass without dispute. William I's decision to divide his English from his Norman lands brought new troubles in its train. The greater barons possessed property on both sides of the Channel. They therefore now owed feudal allegiance to two sovereign lords, and not unnaturally they sought to play one against the other. Both Duke Robert and William II were dissatisfied with the division, and their brotherly ties did not mitigate their covetous desires, i.e. both wanted everything. During the 13 years of the reign of William Rufus, the Anglo-Norman realm was vexed by fratricidal strife and successive baronial revolts." End quote. Okay, so although William Rufus's reign was 13 years long and he was never usurped, it was a period of unease and strife. It wasn't smooth, quite far from smooth. But one point there Churchill made, which I wanted to sort of stress, was the line there where he said, compared to William the Conqueror's reign, William II's reign was not less harsh, but also capricious. I mean, William the Conqueror's reign was harsh, really quite harsh, right? I mean, obviously the first thing to say is the harrying of the North, but that's sort of the least of it. There was all sorts of things. The forest laws, if you were caught hunting a stag, for example, a deer or something in one of his forests, you'd be blinded or have your hands cut off or just killed. And again, the harrying of the North. You can't get much harsher than a genocide, can you? And so William II's was more harsh. It was harsher than that and capricious. Like you didn't even know what was coming. You didn't even know what he'll do next. And it might be extremely cruel. So to be more harsh and capricious than William the Conqueror, that's saying something, really. I'll just pause here essentially to say a word or two just about my feelings about William Rufus, my sort of overall thoughts or impressions of him. I think he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Not mad as in, clinically insane necessarily, although, something approaching psychopathic, I think. He was certainly dangerous. He's one of those people, I've said this before a few times, but would you be comfortable sitting at a table with them, having a conversation or a meal or sharing a drink with them, sharing an evening with them? Would you be comfortable? I wouldn't be comfortable around William Rufus, I don't think. Not that he was, a complete psychopath. Someone like Stalin, I consider Stalin really some sort of psychopath. Where if you said the wrong thing or if you didn't react in exactly the right way to his likings, whatever he was saying, then he might just have you killed. Not quite that, I don't think, but possibly something approaching that. You certainly would be on your best behaviour around him, I would have thought. He would fly off the handle. A lot of these Normans, or even the Plantagenets, we'll get onto that in later epochs, are all supposed to have had terrible tempers. If you did cross them or if you did do something wrong or something they didn't like, they would fly off the handle, and didn't have great impulse control, self-control. And William Rufus is one of them. I would be, walking on eggshells around him, I think. But we'll get into some more details. So Sir Charles Oman, if I can carry on with him, I'll probably be quoting from him the most because he has the most detail in his book about it. He wrote this, quote, William the Conqueror, this is, William had left behind him 3 sons. To Robert the eldest, the rebel of 1079, he had bequeathed not the English crown, but his own ancient heritage of Normandy. William the Red, the second son, who had always been his father's loyal helper, was to be King of England. So Oman just says that, nothing about that William the Conqueror had a personal wish that maybe, if it was God's will, Rufus would inherit England. He just says he just got it. Henry, the youngest son, was left only a legacy of £5,000. Of course, that's a great deal of money in the late 11th century. Huge amount of money, really. He was left a legacy of £5,000. The Conqueror would not parcel out his dominions any further, but said that his latest born was too capable a man not to make his own way in the world. Well, there you go. William the Red hurried over to England the moment that the breath was out of his father's body, and was duly crowned by Lanfranc, the Archbishop. But it was no easy heritage that he took up. The Conqueror's death was the instant signal for the outbreak of feudal anarchy. All the more turbulent of the Norman barons and bishops, headed by Odo of Bayeux, recently let out of jail, if you remember, talks about that in a previous one. William the Conqueror had put his brother, Odo, in jail for, well, it says it here, who had just been released from prison. He took arms, Odo of Bayeux, who had just been released from prison, him and others, took arms, garrisoned their castles, and began to harass their neighbours. They made it their pretext that Duke Robert, as the eldest son, ought to succeed his father in all his dominions, but their true reason was for espousing his cause was that Robert was known to be a weak and shiftless personage, under whose rule every great man would be able to do whatever he might please. So that's another thing. If William Rufus was sort of mad, bad, and dangerous to know, Robert Curthose, his older brother, is not really that. I don't want to really paint the picture that he was a soft touch or anything, because I don't think he was. But he was a softer touch, let's put it that way, than both William the Conqueror and William Rufus. He was a man of his time and a crusader. Apparently he was a very brave and gallant fighter when it came to actual sword play. He was completely prepared to get stuck in and chop people up and put his own life in danger and all that sort of thing. So I don't think he was soft. I wouldn't say that. But, what did Oman use? He says he was a shiftless personage. And there are other quotes where he gets described as, sort of lazy. Maybe that's a word to say. But there were certainly other people like his barons and other great magnates and men around him that were much more in the mould of William the First and Second, where there's no weakness in them at all, none. They're sort of hard-boiled. Whereas Curthose, it seems like there was an element to him where he could let himself be pushed around a little bit, just a little bit, and that's all it took. You know, lots of things in life. If you're only slightly better at something, well, that's it. You will always win. You know. If you're slightly stronger than someone, you can nearly always overpower them, for example, you know? So, if there's just a few chinks in Robert Curthose's armour, metaphorically speaking, then that was enough for him to sort of get a little bit bullied and pushed around by people around him. And, that's sort of what happened.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.